What if the person you loved more than anyone was permanently changed by dementia, and you became their caregiver? Your relationship would change, and becoming a caregiver would probably change you. It's changed me. My name is Aaron, and I'm currently caring full-time for Diane, my wife of nearly 30 years. She has advanced Lewy body disease. I started the Diane Project to tell stories about our journey. Some stories are about the past. Some are about the here and now. I hope you get something from them. Today, I'll be reading a story that originally posted on Substack on Christmas Day 2024. It's titled, "This is Soup Club." It's been adapted for audio. Be sure to subscribe to the Diane Project wherever you get your podcasts. I also put out a newsletter with bonus material. You can subscribe at thedianeproject.com. It was the morning after the election. I awoke at 4 a.m. to answer a call of nature, in this case, my wife's. She calls to me most nights. I reach over and touch her to put her at ease, then get up and walk to her side of the bed. She's always happy to see me. The feeling is mutual. On this night, we made our short round trip to the bathroom. Then I put her to bed and shuffled into the kitchen. I like going to bed with Diane. Retiring at 8:30 buys me a lot of sacred morning time. But I missed out on the election results, so I put in my earbuds and turned on Sky News. I listened long enough to make coffee, then shut it off. Over breakfast, we watched a little more coverage, and I explained the results to her in simple terms. The black lady and the Minnesota governor lost. Then I switched the TV to music, and she listened while I made soup. Our faith community has a sister farm in western Illinois, and it was their butternut harvest that week. Someone brought me a massive squash that was like holding a gallon of milk. They could have swaddled this thing and used it in the Christmas pageant. But I had 8 quarts of soup to make, so I used it all. At 10 a.m., one of Diane's aides arrived. I took my stock pot off the stove, loaded it into the soup wagon, and headed to work. I rent a desk at Office 805, a co-working space that's a bicycle ride from my house. The owner, Dan Blyer, is a gregarious, funny, generous-minded person who exemplifies Evanston. His longtime friend and co-conspirator, Charlie Davidson, has his office next to the break room, where the three of us kibitz. A few weeks ago, Charlie walked in and found me making a post-marathon feast. "You know what we should do?" Charlie said, pointing to the Instant Pot. "We should do soup." And lo, 805 Soup Club was born. On this day, I've made chunky butternut squash soup. Someone else brought a huge roaster filled with chili. Attendance at Soup Club has grown steadily, though Charlie and I have had to get on Dan's case to promote it more. After all, the first rule of Soup Club is talk about Soup Club. The second rule of Soup Club is talk about the soup. Everyone compliments the chefs and asks how they made their soup. I added chickpeas for protein, farro for texture, then I used my stick blender to make a chunky puree. I doubt that homemade soup will cure a post-election hangover, though I suppose it couldn't hurt. But no one in Soup Club that day even mentioned the election. The mood was relaxed, chatty. Everyone seemed happy, even those of us who voted for the losers. A friend had texted me with sincere feeling, "Hope you are okay this morning." The day after the election, I kept getting hints that others around Evanston, which went 92% for Harris, were struggling with the results. The local college was even offering post-election wellness spaces to help students cope with their loss. I was one of the 92%ers. What right did I have to enjoy soup with these people, some of whom I'm pretty sure voted for Trump? For one thing, like most of my Democratic friends, I'm a well-educated U.S. citizen, so it's unlikely my world will be rocked by anything the next president does. There will be policies that I'll strongly oppose, but I'm a firm believer that past is prologue, and that means that Trump 47 will be a crap show of self-serving noise and chaos, just like Trump 45 was. For another thing, my priorities have changed. I'm currently focused on the 16 hours or so per day that I spend on caregiving duty with Diane. Once it became clear that the election would be Trump's to lose, I had to take stock of how much psychic energy I wanted to spend on this guy. Fortunately, my wife could help me answer that question. When we lived in Kansas City, Diane and I had a nightly ritual around the TV. I made dinner while we watched Jeopardy, then local news, the network news, and finally, the NewsHour. Starting about a year after her diagnosis in 2020, Diane gradually lost interest in the news. Nowadays, a few minutes is all she can tolerate. One of our aides was watching the NewsHour with her recently when she said, in a perfectly clear voice, "I don't understand this." About a year ago, we shifted to a new nightly ritual: music videos. Classical, jazz, folk, gospel, early female pop. There's endless variety on YouTube, and for $10 a month, it'll skip the ads. One fine day in late spring or early summer, we were on the couch, listening to music. I was also checking the news on my phone. Suddenly, Diane turned to me and said, "What's going on?" Nothing was going on, but a story I thought I was reading to myself had provoked me. A muscle twitched, or I muttered something. I was so absorbed in the story that I hadn't even noticed my reaction. But she did. This kept happening over time. I could tell it was upsetting her. Each time I assured her nothing was going on, but she didn't always buy it. Then I had one of my aha moments. Let me try to explain it. As a cognitive disease progresses, a person often loses their inhibitions. That happened to Diane starting about a year after her diagnosis. If I said something she objected to, or did something she didn't want done, she would quickly get upset, profane, emotional. At first, I was taken aback by this. One time I said, "That escalated quickly," which she didn't appreciate. Then I learned from other caregivers that this is quite common. I had to accept this change and adapt to it. From then, I began to view her hypersensitivity in a new light. Like all couples, we had our squabbles. We tried to fight fairly, make up lovingly. I was the hothead. I got a lot of feedback about the tone of my voice. I tried to do better, didn't always succeed. But now, here she was, giving it all back to me with interest. And the kicker was, I couldn't argue with her anymore. If she was upset, that was my problem. The only way to restore order was to apologize profusely and be kinder. With great regret, I realized that these were behaviors I should have been modeling long ago. Better late than never. So this was on my mind as I sat on the couch one day with her. I was noticing that when I checked my news app, something I read or listened to could trigger me, and this reaction would be upsetting to Diane. My attempts to explain away my reactions were useless. She didn't want to hear the story I was reading. Her life is lived in the liminal space where cognition is no longer necessary. And if I was going to be with her right there in that moment, I needed to respect that. I needed to put her feelings above my interests. It was kind of like having a marriage argument, except this was an argument that I had to be willing to lose. And so I deleted that news app. I also got Facebook off my iPhone screen, so now I almost never open it. I trimmed my newsletters and my podcasts to a well-tempered few. And with that, election madness more or less vanished into the ether. Maybe it was a coincidence, but Diane and I are having our best stretch of days and nights since our caregiving journey began. And I don't think I've really missed that much. Well, there's one thing I do miss: our nightly news ritual. In our big house in Kansas City, we'd pass each other during the day like ferry boats. Then we would come together at night to eat, watch, and talk. I would keep the remote handy, and she would say, "Pause it." I'd pause, and we'd talk for a minute or two. Maybe about something on the news, maybe something else. I'm not sure our nightly ritual connected us to our world so much as it reconnected us to each other. And I do miss that terribly. Cognitive caregiving is a lonely task. Loneliness, according to the U.S. Surgeon General, is as hard on a body as smoking 15 Camels a day. Others may disagree with that, but I think the comparison is dead on. When we doom scroll instead of making real-life connections, we make ourselves mentally and physically unhealthy. And just as big tobacco preys on heavy smokers, the tech industry profits off its most addicted users by continuously feeding their outrage and fears. Thanks to the work of John Haidt and his book, The Anxious Generation, we now have solid evidence that social media does unique harms to the mental health of teenagers, especially girls. But not a lot of people are asking the follow-up question. If it's doing that to our kids, what's it doing to the grown-ups? The tragic aspect of our obsession with our screens is that it leads to thoughts and behaviors that go against our nature. A growing consensus among scientists is that we're hardwired to be optimistic and connect with others, not just family and allies, but neighbors, communities, even perfect strangers. Friendliness is in our DNA. Several excellent books on this topic have come out in recent years, but the one I want to tell you about is Humankind: A Hopeful History. This 2019 global bestseller by Dutch journalist Rutger Bregman was one of the 3 most influential books I read in 2024 and was very helpful as I was pulling away from my lifelong media habits. Speaking of which, if you're a regular watcher of 60 Minutes, I guarantee you have seen stories based on chapters from Bregman's book. One is about the long-forgotten saga of the real Lord of the Flies.
It's a tale of a group of schoolboys stranded on a remote and deserted island for more than 15 months. It might remind you of the famous novel Lord of the Flies by William Golding. But as you'll see, the outcome of this real-life story could not have been more different.
Instead of competing viciously for the island's scarce resources, they cooperated, handled disputes peacefully, and lived large. When they were finally rescued, the castaways were found to be in excellent health and even better spirits. Bregman also writes about Brian Hare, whose research into the emergence of dogs from ancestral wolves was too irresistible for 60 Minutes to pass up. Hare's thesis is that the least vicious wolves began cooperating with humans, and as their friendliness was rewarded, they evolved. As Bregman writes in Humankind, Brian Hare was inspired by a long-running Russian experiment that turned silver foxes, a completely wild breed, into docile pups through selective breeding. This experiment was vital to understanding why Homo sapiens became the dominant hominoid, while our rivals, including Homo neanderthalensis, died out. Bregman writes, The Neanderthal brain was on average 15% larger than our brains now. We have a MacBook Air, they got a MacBook Pro. Neanderthals were cooks, artisans, astoundingly intelligent, not to mention ripped as hell. And until recently, the leading theory behind their disappearance is that Homo sapiens simply wiped them out. Yuval Noah Harari, in his book, Sapiens, called it the first and most significant ethnic cleansing campaign in history. Harari admits his proof is thin, mostly smashed Neanderthal skulls. But, as Jared Diamond noted in his review of Harari's book, murderers have been convicted on weaker circumstantial evidence. The fact that Harari and Diamond have written bestsellers that reinforce negative notions of human nature should serve as a reminder that bad news doesn't just live on our screens. As Bregman notes, 2 generations of readers were influenced by the Richard Dawkins book, The Selfish Gene, which ended with the author's exhortation, "Let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish." But it turns out, we aren't. The problem with the Neanderthals, writes Bregman, is that they were rugged individualists. They hated cooperating. The smaller-brained sapiens formed alliances, trade networks, dynasties. They weren't smarter or more clever, but they were friendly. Homo puppy, as Bregman puts it. Or, as Brian Hare, the dog evolutionist, explained to Anderson Cooper,
humans 100,000 years ago, our species was not alone. There were at least 4 to 5 other human species. And the question then becomes, well, why are we the only one left? And we think, and what dogs point to, is that we were the friendliest species that ever evolved among humans, and that we survived because we are friendly.
Okay, then why are human beings such turds to each other? If our DNA is toward friendliness, how do you explain Bashar al-Assad? Well, it's complicated. And that's why Humankind is a book, not a tweet. But basically, our desire to connect with others can be manipulated. We can be drawn into groups that view other groups with suspicion, fear, even hatred. Tribalism is great if you follow a sports team, not so great if you follow a fascist ideology. Bregman explains all this in Humankind in his ingratiating and compelling style that is aided from a lively English translation by Elizabeth Manton and Erica Moore. Now, the heart of the book, in my opinion, is the early chapters, where Bregman takes on the pop culture-driven belief that humans are awful by nature. One by one, he opens up those old depravity tropes that I was raised on, not just Lord of the Flies, but the Milgram experiment, the killing of Kitty Genovese, the tragedy of the commons, why we can't have nice things, and peels back the layers to expose a shocking pattern of shoddy research, bogus reasoning, and lazy journalism. Well, I guess it's shocking if you haven't been on X lately. Bregman explains that while we are indeed wired for friendliness, we have another evolutionary strategy known as negativity bias, also called the fight or flight instinct. It was meant to be used in rare emergencies. The problem is that big tech has developed a lucrative business model around triggering that fight or flight instinct 50 times a day. Bregman writes, "It's by tapping into our negativity bias that these digital platforms make their money. Because bad behavior grabs our attention, it's what generates the most clicks. And where we click, the advertising dollars follow. And each time we click, we're ensuring more helpings of those same messages, each of them reinforcing our negative thoughts. In this way, technology nurtures us to contradict our nature. Then it becomes an article of faith that humans suck." Among other harms, thinking that way is really stressful, like 15 cigarettes a day is stressful. Bregman's remedy is to simply avoid TV news, turn off push notifications, and read more nuanced pieces instead of quick hits. Above all, he writes, disengage from your screen and meet real people in the flesh. Think as carefully about what information you feed your mind as you do about the food you feed your body. That's food for thought. Which reminds me, there's one more rule to Soup Club. It's never about the soup. Lately, I've been pedaling a second bike around Evanston. This one has a small wagon attached to the back, perfect for transporting a large pot of soup. I love leaving the CRV at home and using the soup wagon to haul groceries, garden supplies, the weekly CSA drop, and books from our warehouse in Skokie, as well as the eponymous pots of lunch. If there's an object that captures 2024 and the work I did connecting with people, it's this Amazon purchase and the bicycle that it's attached to. Our backyard house faces an apartment building. Now, in the past, Diane would have been the first to go in and meet our new neighbors there. Fortunately, she's made me a friendlier and more social animal over the years. So I began reaching out. And one of the first people I met was Sabine Gorga. She was a delightful woman who taught at a community college and was, like me, a cancer survivor. Her parking spot was in the alley, and we often talked as she was coming and going. Earlier this year, Sabine confided to me that her cancer had returned. I'm telling you, she said wearily one morning, radiation is kicking my ass. A few weeks later, I got an urgent text from her. She was going into hospice and needed help clearing out her apartment. When I arrived with a crew from my faith community, she was lying on her bed, barely able to gesture. She told me to take what I wanted. I took her old 3-speed bicycle, and now it's pulling the soup wagon. Be sure to subscribe where you get your podcasts, and come visit me at thedianeproject.com. Take care.